It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. This country is always a pleasure to come to because of the hospitality that it shows. And so I'd like to thank you very much for the hospitality so far. I hope that what I say this afternoon will not suddenly make that hospitality vanish. It's my intention to pursue the thought of how to communicate chemistry and how to overcome the problems that people have with understanding chemistry. You'll be relieved to know that I shall tell you nothing that you do not already know. So you can have a very quiet afternoon for the next 50 minutes or so. Except maybe right at the very end, where I shall begin to explore some of the consequences of what you already know, but which you might not have pursued in your own thoughts. So I'm going to talk about the problems of communicating chemistry to the general public. And we all know that one of the difficulties to overcome is the sense that people ascribe the problems that the Earth currently faces, in many instances, to chemistry. We know that there are problems with overpopulation, and in a sense, although population itself is admirable, overpopulation is not, and it is partly through chemistry that we have overpopulation, because we can keep so many more people alive, we can feed so many more people through chemistry. So the basis of overpopulation is really chemistry. There is, of course, also the question of pollution, which is manifestly a problem of chemistry, at least in the way that it produces the environmental damage. And we must take responsibility, and people certainly ascribe to chemistry those problems. Then, of course, there's the way that we rape the earth in order to produce all the artifacts of modern civilization. And once again, chemistry underlies the grasp for raw materials. And of course, perhaps the worst of all, the way that chemistry contributes to warfare, both in the form of physical weapons, the explosives that drive projectiles, and also, and especially it's very common, it's very pertinent at the moment, the dreadful way that chemists have developed materials for chemical warfare. So these are the images, I think, that we have to try to overcome. But there are solutions. Once we can sort of remove those aspects, we will be able to present chemistry as something that is vitally important. And I think it's really through education. And of course, education is the root of the solution of almost all problems in the universe, basically. So the fact that we are meeting in a university which is devoted to education means that we're in a position to start to overcome those perceptions of chemistry. And I'll begin, I think, thinking about the education of people about chemistry by trying to identify what I regard as the three principal difficulties of conveying chemistry to the general public. And indeed, it isn't just the general public that I have in mind. It's also the student beginning his or her course in chemistry, because they are very much like the general public. So what are the perceived difficulties? I think one difficulty is the abstract nature of the concepts that we need to discuss. Whenever we need to discuss any aspect of chemistry, it is inevitable that we start to talk about atoms and molecules, energy, entropy, bonds, and so on. And all those are felt to be really abstract entities that we cannot possibly really understand if we are a poet or if we are someone in the humanities and so on, or just a general person in the street. I think a second difficulty is what I call conflict. One of the aspects of chemistry is that there is often no clear-cut, precise, obvious answer to no obvious way of making a prediction, because there are so many conflicting influences. You don't know whether it's going to be the radius of an atom that is dominant. You don't know if it's going to be the ionization energy. You don't know whether it's going to be some other aspect of the problem that you're talking about. So people find it very difficult, I think, to identify what is the major influence in leading to a chemical explanation. I think, incidentally, that it's that conflict, the problem of conflict, which makes an education in chemistry such an important way of preparing people for life outside the laboratory. I think it certainly is the case with my students when I was actively teaching, that people from commerce came, people from industry came, people from banking came, looking for chemists, because chemists are trained to resolve conflict in the sense of deciding what is a dominant influence. And they are prepared to identify conflicting influences. And that is exactly what you need in commerce, in industry, and so on. So chemists have a transferable skill that enables them to move from their training in the courses on chemistry to applications in commerce, in industry, in banking, and so on. It makes people very valuable in the marketplace for employment in their lives. And of course, there is language. I think everyone knows that that chemists talk in a bizarre language, and it is very easy for them to slip into using terms that someone in the man or the woman in the street does not recognize. So, but whenever you have difficulties, there are ways of overcoming them. And I think that the solutions, I'll put one solution up for each of these difficulties. One of the solutions is to the problem of abstraction is the use of computer graphics. I think computer graphics is the most wonderful way of presenting complex concepts to people without the paraphernalia of mathematics and language and so on. You get a direct visual impact of what a person is talking about. And I think it very that television companies don't turn to graphics in order to promote chemistry. That's a wonderful way of explaining what chemistry is all about. And I think, as we were talking over dinner only last night about the skills that younger generations have that we older generations were not brought up with. And I think one of the skills that you have that perhaps we're not so fully immersed in is the familiarity with the representation of images. You're looking at your screens all the time. I mean, you're living in a very visual world. And I think we chemists should use graphics in order to convey our concepts and our achievements. I think when it comes to conflict, it's only patience. We have to train people. I think when you're talking about chemistry and giving any explanation in science, you have to be very patient with the people that you are talking to. They do not have the background. You must fill in the background. They are impatient for knowledge. They must really accept that some of our explanations take a long time to unroll. I think also when it comes to language, the only problem is just being cautious about our use of our technical terms and to avoid them as much as possible. So I think there are ways ahead. And of course, we should never forget that although chemistry brings difficulties to living, it also brings many rewards. And some of the rewards, all the rewards will be very familiar to you. I mean, I think the greatest reward of all is chemistry's contribution to medicine. And if I were to identify one aspect of chemistry's contribution to medicine that I value more than anything, it's the development of anesthetics. I mean, there is nothing worse than pain. And I think anything that overcomes pain, even if it does not deal with the root cause of the pain, is really a wonderful achievement. If you're going to have an amputation, as this poor man was having, then all you could do was to have a glass of brandy and just grit your teeth and hope that it was all over in a few minutes. And indeed, in many cases, of course, it was all over in a few minutes. But medicine and chemistry's contribution to medicine really has enhanced our lives immeasurably. Of course, it's also prolonged them. But chemistry, you should tell the people that you're talking to, has changed the whole texture of the world. 100 years ago, the texture of the world, when you touched it, it was wood, it was iron, it was leather. And when chemistry came along, of course, suddenly it has become everything you touch, almost everything you touch, is synthetic. So the whole feeling of the world is now different through the contributions that chemistry has made. And I think it's essential to point out to your listener that this has transformed the world immeasurably. And of course, what chemistry has also provided is color in the world. It's suddenly transformed the world of dull greens and browns and blacks into the vibrant colors that just look around you and you will see the colors. So what chemistry does, effectively, if you were to remove the contributions of chemistry, it would take us literally back to the Stone Age. And so we should be very proud, I think, of the way that we have transformed living in such a positive way. But with these thoughts, I suppose another very important way is, I use this analogy of listening to music. And of course, you can listen to music just simply enjoying it without thinking about it in a deep way. But you get deeper delight if you understand the structure of the music and can turn on an inner ear to listen to the way that the music was constructed. You don't need to do that, but it gives you a deeper delight if you choose to do that. And chemistry does exactly the same. It enables you to look at a scene and to understand the mechanism by which that beauty has been generated. So what chemistry provides you with is an inner eye this time, so that you can look inside phenomena. You can look inside scenes like this and discover a deeper delight. You don't need to. You can just look at a scene and say, that is beautiful. Or you can look at a smell of fragrance and say, that is attractive. But if you want to, then you have this intellectual switch that you can turn on and to think intellectually about the origin of the beauty itself. And I think that chemistry provides all the material benefits that we experience in the world. It also provides that intellectual benefit of being able to understand what is going on underneath appearances. And of course, that is what science is all about, really, to understand the mechanism of phenomena. I mean, one look at something resembling last night's dinner and take pleasure from understanding the colors, the textures, the tastes, the smells, and so on. And I think it just adds delight. What I want to do now is, having sort of given you the ammunition to show the general public the advantages of understanding just a little bit of chemistry, is to try to identify what I regard as the basic principles that everyone should know. Now, all these principles will be entirely well known to you, but I just want to assemble them so that we understand, so that you can bring them out when you need them. And what I've done is to identify what I think it is 9 core principles which everyone should know and which you should think of sharing with the general public in order to educate them in ways of thinking chemically. In a sense, of course, what I'm going to do is to give you 9 chapters of a book of general chemistry. But of course, at a university level, one would deal with each topic in greater depth. But I want to find just the core ideas that, if you know them, you can say, yes, I understand what a chemist is now talking about. So the most obvious one, of course, is the view that matter is composed of atoms. Richard Feynman once said that if there was a nuclear holocaust and he was lying next to a rock and he wanted to carve on that rock a message which, when the cockroaches that had survived gradually evolved and had become scientists, what message would give them the most advantage in proceeding in the world of science? And his selection of ideas was that matter is composed of atoms, totally fundamental to the way that we think about science in the modern world. So atoms are the currency of chemistry, that we cannot talk about chemistry unless we accept that matter is atomic. And so what I want people to do is to look at matter and perceive it, not in terms of appearances, but in terms of its inner structure, in terms of atoms. So absolutely core, central concept to what is understood, to an understanding of chemistry. In a way, I think we chemists are builders of bridges. We build a bridge from the perceived into the underworld of atoms and molecules. And what we need to do is to be able to move freely across that bridge from the phenomena to the infrastructure. I think crucially also that the atoms are not just unrelated, that it's crucial to understand that matter can be understood rationally. And of course that is epitomized by, first of all, thinking about a whole collection of different elements, and then discovering the amazing truth that these are not unrelated personalities, that they can be put in order. And so we have the periodic table. And I think the realization that matter can be discussed rationally is an extraordinarily important step. And I suppose if I were to identify the type of observation that made this rationalization possible, I would say that it was the use of the chemical balance and the ability to weigh matter. Because at last, you had a way of attaching numbers to matter. And once you can attach numbers to matter, you can start to discuss the relationships between matter rationally. And it's really going all the way back to John Dalton, who really first applied measurements, and Lavoisier, I suppose, who first attached numbers to matter that enabled them ultimately to come to this rationalization. And although the periodic table is now so familiar to us all, we should never lose sight of the fact that it's extraordinary that something like oxygen and sulfur, so different in appearance, are actually so closely related. And it's the discovery of the interrelations between types of matter that is totally is crucial to the development of chemistry. And of course, it enables us to see trends, as here in atomic radius and so on, and to underline the rationality of matter. And of course, it leads to all sorts of artistic expression. Once you've got atoms, of course, the next crucial aspect of understanding chemistry is that you can link them together and get, if not words, then at least molecules and compounds in general. So I think people should realize that once you have the 100 or so different elements, from it you can get all the material that surrounds us in the world. And I think to understand chemistry and to understand the nature of matter, you need to be able to convey pictures like that. And I think if I were to identify the property of matter, the property of molecules, the property of atoms and so on, that is crucially important and helps to overcome the sense that we're dealing with abstract entities, then I think I would identify shape as the most important property that atoms and molecules possess. Once you understand shape, then effectively you understand the way that atoms and molecules contribute to the general world. So shape, not only in biology, but shape is also crucial to function in chemistry and in physics, as well as in biology. My favorite example of the role of shape is the role of shape in vision. I mean, you'll all be familiar with this, but I think to understand vision, you need to understand the retinal molecule in the retina of your eye with its particular shape. And that when a photon comes in and excites it and weakens that bond, then of course the shape can change. So what one is achieving really as photons hit your retina is that change of shape. Absolutely crucial. It's happening to you all now as you sit there. In your eye, these retinal molecules are busily flipping from one shape to another shape. And of course, they sit inside a protein. And they sit inside the protein because of their shape. And when their shape changes, they can no longer fit inside the protein, so they're expelled. And that changes the structure of the protein, and that sends a signal along the nerves into the optic centers of the brain. And in some mysterious way, you see an image like this. So once again, shape is absolutely crucial to understanding biological phenomena, but it's also absolutely crucial to understanding other aspects of chemistry. So I think if you were to look at the periodicity of atomic radii, then that underlies also the periodicity of ionization energies and electron affinities. And so you begin to understand why all matter behaves as it does. And of course, once you've got molecules, then those molecules are not just individuals, but there are combinations of molecules. One gets condensed matter. And I think taking that step from individual atoms and molecules into the world of bulk matter is a crucial part of the understanding of the way chemists think about the world, think about water. I won't show that animation. Next most important concept, in my view, is something that I don't understand at all, which is energy. I mean, everyone understands the word. Everyone thinks they know what it is. But it's the most extraordinary concept that pervades the whole of the way we think about chemistry. Energy, and I'll say a few words about energy and then come back to it also at the end of my talk this afternoon. It's certainly the energy is the, if you like, is the policeman. It's the police who decide what is legitimate change and what is illegitimate change. And only legitimate change occurs in the uncorruptible world of the conservation of energy. And so energy really controls just about everything that can happen to atoms and molecules. Just as we've seen so far the rationalization of the structure of matter, now we're beginning to see the origins of the rationalization of the changes that matter can undergo. And that we can understand, of course it's important in the sense that we can understand fuels in terms of energy. We can understand all sorts of physical processes, and we can think of bond formation in terms of energy and so on. But it remains, in my view, an extraordinarily abstract and difficult concept to grasp. I knew when the word energy entered into science in general, it was early in April in 1807. Until then, and if you go back to Newton did not use the term energy. Everything that Newton talked about in his mechanics was in terms of force and the response of bodies to force. And force is tangible. You know what force represents. And then Thomas Young, who was working at the Royal Institution in London, woke up on that morning in early April 1807 and said, I know, I shall define a quantity called energy. And like other abstract terms, it became extraordinarily powerful. And the textbooks of the day, the physics textbooks of the day, were rewritten because the concept of energy was so powerful and unifying, even though no one really understood what it was about. People had used the term energy before 1807. The English poet Philip Sidney was shot dead by a musket ball, and he had used the term energy in the way that of describing the energy of someone's writing, how effective it was and how impulsive the writing was. It would have been much better for him had he understood the kinetic energy of that musket ball that was about to kill him. So energy had been used in literature, but it was transported into science in 1807 and then transformed our way of thinking. We know how to recognize it because we know that energy is the capacity to do work. But beyond that, I challenge you really to help me to understand this extraordinary and very powerful concept. I shall come back to the power of abstraction shortly. Although the concept of energy emerged, I'll come back to it now in fact, I think although the concept of energy emerged from studies of the steam engine, which is a much more modern steam engine than the 19th century steam engines that the early thermodynamics people studied, but nevertheless it was through the study of heat engines of this kind that the concept of energy emerged, and the relations between work and heat were established. And that people decided that they could represent a physical steam engine by an abstract heat engine with a hot source, a cold sink, and a device between them for converting the flow of energy as heat into the flow of energy as work. And that was a very important abstract moment, a moment of great importance in the development of science, because it abstracted the essence of the steam engine. And once you abstract the essence of something and express it in abstract ways, so you may discover that it is applicable in totally unrelated fields. And in particular, it's applicable, for example, to the metabolic processes occurring inside human bodies and so on. So one of the great aspects of science is the identification of concepts that can be rendered abstract, because once they have been rendered abstract, they can be applied to many disparate phenomena. And I think if you were to take a young student and say, what is the most important procedure in science, then I think you would say it is abstracting the essence of an idea, of a concept, and because then you're given power over many other phenomena. I think my other, if I were in the same mood at the moment to identify another guiding principle of science, is one of my very most favorite quotations, which is that being a scientist is seeing what everyone else has seen, but thinking what so far no one else has thought. So I think looking around you and seeing everyday phenomena, but thinking about it in a new way, means that you are being scientifically creative and really understanding the nature of the world. But I'll come back to that again later. So abstraction is crucial. And I think abstracting, we saw that the concept of energy is abstract. We've seen that just looking at a steam engine, you can abstract from it its core principles, and then you can understand a whole landscape of different phenomena. But of course, once you've got energy, you get what I regard as one of those powerful laws in the whole of science. You get to the reason why, even though the total quantity of energy doesn't change, its quality can change. And in the course of that change in quality, it accounts for all the phenomena of the world, not just chemical reactions. So my most favorite law in science, because it explains so much, is the second law of thermodynamics. Simply, as everyone knows, simply says that things get worse. That, in other words, we don't get that, but we do get that. So matter and energy have a natural tendency to spread in disorder. And I think that's such a powerful idea, so simple, yet accounts for just about everything that takes place in the world. And the way that I like to use it is, once again, pictorially. And I think people were still thinking of talking to people in the street about the core principles of chemistry. And I think, although the second law, if you say it formally, is frightening, and people are turned off even if you mention it, it is at root extraordinarily simple. And like most simplicities, extraordinarily powerful. And the way that I introduce it to sort of non-scientists really is to say that effectively the second law simply says that localized matter or localized energy tends to disperse in disorder. But the key point is that this dispersal in disorder might take place in an environment which can link into it. And drive the possibility of disorder being transformed into order. So this might be a hydrocarbon fuel, and it might be burning inside an internal combustion engine, and so the hydrocarbon molecules are dispersed as carbon dioxide and water, and the energy that this also represents is also dispersed. But the engine is constructed in such a way that it can link in to that process of dispersal. And possibly, if it is connected to a machine somewhere else, then it can take a pile of bricks and build from those bricks a cathedral. So providing the net dispersal is positive. It is possible for there to be local abatements of chaos and for structures to emerge. So we can see the whole connection, really, between the great disperser in the sky, where the energy released in nuclear fusion is released and captured in the vegetation on Earth. And that vegetation might prove to be our breakfast. And this is no longer an internal combustion engine, it is now our body. This is the digestion process. And this is the metabolic processes that occur within our body. And this might be a pile of amino acids which are floating around inside our bodies. And these amino acids are converted into this small cathedral, this molecular cathedral, which is a protein molecule. So as we eat, so we grow. Even, you could take it even more fancifully if you want. You could say, well, this represents the random collection of electric and synaptic currents in our brains, in our resting brains, if you like. Because we've eaten, these random synaptic currents are converted into organized thought. And so in the process of living, of eating, so we generate works of art, scientific understanding, and so on. So the second law is all-pervasive, in my view, that it enables you to understand all the processes going on in the world, and of course, by implication, all the processes going on in chemistry. Deeply, deeply satisfying. The English novelist C.P. Snow, now happily long forgotten for his string of rather tedious novels, although he was himself trained as a chemist. Once he became a minister in the British government, and it's just being trained in chemistry can do for you. And he said that not knowing the second law of thermodynamics is like never having read a work by Shakespeare. True, I'm sure I have two thoughts about that. Probably totally meaningless today when no one anyway reads works of Shakespeare. And secondly, I'm pretty convinced that C.P. Snow hadn't a clue about the meaning of the second law of thermodynamics himself. But no, that's just my personal opinion. Anyway, it's crucial, and it saddens me greatly that there are millions of corpses lying 2 meters under the surface of the earth, who have never heard the second law of thermodynamics. And I would like to wake them up and say, before it's too late, understand why you are dead because of the second law. It is such a wonderful law and so easy to understand. So we understand through energy the capacity for change. We understand through entropy, the second law, the driving force for change. But we need to understand why the world doesn't suddenly collapse into maximum worseness. And of course, the reason is that there are barriers to change. That because there are barriers to change, there is time for complexity to emerge. After all, evolution by natural selection is just a very subtle way of the second law of thermodynamics driving the whole complex structure of this world forward into even greater complexity. But doing it slowly, carefully, well, not carefully, there's no care in evolution, it's just random, but doing it slowly because all the reactions that are involved have barriers that need to be overcome. And as a consequence, this kind of beautiful scene can emerge. Industry, of course, depends upon the manipulation of those barriers. So we can understand the role of catalysis in industry. It's a manipulator of barriers. That cooking is also a manipulation of the heights of those barriers and the ability to overcome them. And of course, right at the end, I think the ninth idea that I would identify is really the raison d'etre of chemistry, that atoms can exchange partners. I mean, so although we look in, we see a chemist doing that, what he or she is doing, of course, is changing partners. And so we can understand what a chemist is up to in the laboratory by coaxing one partner to become a partner of someone else. So we can understand much of chemistry through the transfer of either a proton, or we can understand much of chemistry through the transfer of an electron. So we can get really down into the simplicity of the underlying processes of the world simply by understanding that all change simply consists of this very simple process of an electron migrating, of a proton migrating. So those are what I regard as the 9 core ideas. What I'd like to do now is to go a little further down the road that I mentioned right at the start of my talk, which is to look at possibilities that you're all familiar with, but which perhaps you have not pursued in your thoughts. And it's a way of, I think, of encouraging people to study chemistry, because chemistry really puts you in the center of all the sciences. People refer to it, of course, as the central science. And indeed it is, because it draws on physics for its principles. It draws on mathematics for its expression. And it draws on, or contributes to, biology for its applications. And I think by studying chemistry, you are necessarily put in contact with large amounts of physics, large amounts of very simple mathematics, and large amounts of chemistry. Indeed, you could take the view that until 1953, biology was just a series of nature walks. That's a cow, that's a leaf, and so on. In 1953, when the structure of DNA resolved, suddenly chemistry, biology became a member of the physical sciences, and in particular of chemistry. And so all the modern aspects of biology really stem from that seminal discovery more than half a century ago. But to understand biology, of course, we need to understand chemistry. Those are my, I'll just get rid of those. I want to focus on the centrality and to say what happens when we focus on some of the interfaces between chemistry and physics. And I would say that here's a desert island to which I have been banished. What concept would I wish to have as an intellectual companion on this island? A concept that if I had it with me, I could account for almost all chemistry and a lot of physics. And the concept that I would choose to have with me, because I think it is so central to understanding chemical phenomena, is the Boltzmann distribution. I'd hate to have him as the actual living companion. I mean, he was depressive. He hanged himself, and there'd be plenty of opportunity to do that from the palm trees. But I think intellectually, the Boltzmann distribution enables you to understand why matter is stable at low temperatures, and why matter can be transformed at high temperatures, because of the distribution, of course, of molecules over the available states of the system. It gives, I think, the Boltzmann distribution and the way that it is derived simply from random distribution of atoms, molecules, over the available energy levels, and looking for the most probable distribution, is an extraordinary insight into the nature of temperature, the nature of stability, and the nature of chemical transformation. So I would certainly think that the Boltzmann distribution is a wonderful intellectual companion. If I were to look at mathematics and to see where my thoughts would be led, if I were to think about the interface between mathematics and chemistry, I would identify a German mathematician, Emmy Noether, who began life more or less in intellectual life, academic life, in Göttingen, and then went to Pennsylvania and died there, like most mathematicians, mathematicians die. If you think of the bell curve, all mathematicians inhabit one end or the other. They either die before they're 10 or after they're 100, more or less. No one dies at the mean value. And she, poor woman, died too young, but left behind a legacy of extraordinary mathematics. And mathematics that is highly relevant to physics, and through physics to chemistry. A tiny flavor of her most celebrated theorem is the establishment of the relationship between conservation laws and symmetry. She, M.E. Noether, established that wherever you have a conservation law, the reason for it can be found in some kind of underlying symmetry. Now you can perhaps see because we have, as I mentioned it, one of my principal ideas, the conservation of energy. So you should ask yourself, and perhaps you have not ever asked yourself, why is energy conserved? I mean, doing thermodynamics might seem old-fashioned, but it can lead you into interesting questions still, and questions that perhaps you had not considered aren't askable, let alone answerable. But Noether's theorem, when applied to the conservation of energy, says that energy is the reason why energy is conserved is because time is uniform. That is the symmetry. So if you were to think of tick, 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 tick as representing the uniformity of time, then energy is conserved. What you then have to ask, you're beginning now to see a route into understanding why energy is conserved, and therefore why there's the first law of thermodynamics, basically. And what you have to do now is to ask yourself, why is time uniform? Why doesn't it go like that, tick, 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 like it does in some lectures, of course? Because if time went like this, then energy would not be conserved. It's a consequence of Noether's first theorem. You can see why time is uniform, but you can see where these thoughts lead you, springing from chemistry, but leading you into deeper and deeper questions. I think the reason lies here. This slide represents what there was before the creation, when there was absolutely nothing. And I don't mean empty space-time. I mean there was no space, no time. There was just nothing. Absolutely nothing. And in my view, nothing must be uniform. You can't have lumps of nothing, or various screwed up bits of nothing. Nothing has to be absolutely uniform. Otherwise, it wouldn't be nothing. So here's a hypothesis, and I admit it's a hypothesis. When the universe came into existence, the uniformity of nothing was inherited by the uniformity of space-time. And because it inherited that precursing uniformity of absolutely nothing, time became uniform. And because time is uniform, energy is conserved. And therefore, you have the first law of thermodynamics. So you can see how even thinking about such old-fashioned things as the first law can actually lead you into what might be a deep understanding of cosmological processes. And I think that's potentially very exciting. You can extend that, of course, because when space emerged from absolutely nothing, and it inherited the uniformity of absolutely nothing, then this now represents the uniformity on a cosmic scale of space. And Noether's theorem tells you that if space is uniform, not time, if space is uniform, then the conservation law that springs from that uniformity is the conservation of linear momentum. So we know that linear momentum is conserved. It's really at the heart of Newtonian mechanics. And so we've seen another law of nature emerging. Nothing is also isotropic. If you go around any point in nothing, it remains the same. So when space emerges from absolutely nothing, space is isotropic. That's a symmetry. If space is isotropic, angular momentum is conserved. So you can begin to see that out of nothing spring, without intervention, the laws that govern classical mechanics and thermodynamics. And of course, finally, this really will be my final closing remarks, really. The impact of chemistry on biology is incalculable. But I'll just leave you with that thought that I presented earlier on in this talk, that it is through chemistry that our eyes can perceive beauty, but through chemistry we can understand the origins of beauty. So I will finish there. I hope that maybe I have mentioned something that you will find useful as you go out into the world and establish the primacy of chemistry, not only for our own comforts, but for our own pleasures, and also for, and especially, for our own understanding. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your clear talk. I forgot to mention before, Professor Peter Atkins won the American Prize for the Public Understanding of Science. Congratulations for that. Now, we have a couple of minutes for some questions, or okay.
I don't mind turning mine.
That's okay.
I don't mind turning mine off so that you won't hear the answer either.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your brilliant lecture. Very simple, which is important. Simplicity is also important, if not very important in science. I was very glad that you talked a lot, you focused a lot on thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is one of these sub-disciplines that I think, and you agree, merges or where there is an overlap between chemistry and physics, as classically we distinguish chemistry from physics. Well, the first question is, Do you agree on that on that distinction between chemistry and physics, or everything in fact is physics and chemistry is a sub-area of physics? Or can you identify niches of what we call chemistry, where physics does not appear at all? And
I think maybe the distinction is that physicists think that chemists apply physics to impossible substances, like complicated things. But of course, there are no boundaries in science, but there are ways of thinking. And so I think, although there are no intellectual boundaries, if you were to put a physicist in a room and a chemist in another room, and you were to ask them a series of questions, it would not take you long to decide which was the physicist and which was the chemist. I think the chemist would be willing to talk about complex substances, the physicist disinclined. I think the chemist, when asked to do a calculation, would try to do it meticulously and in detail, but a physicist would try to do it by order of magnitude estimates first, and so on. There is a kind of way of approaching problems. I think a physicist would be prepared more to interpret a mathematical expression in terms of physical processes. A chemist would probably just try to use it. So I think there are modes of questioning that could distinguish them.
So it's more a question of background education, because the concepts are the same. If you, let's go back to thermodynamics. It's a good example.
Yeah.
If you go to a course of thermodynamics in a chemistry department, it is taught in a different way from the physics department. But the concepts, the underlying science is the same.
Yeah, I'm sure that if I went to a chemical engineering lecture on thermodynamics, I wouldn't understand a word of it. I mean, the languages and approaches are so different. But of course, they're taking a different perspective on the problems.
Okay, some other questions there?
Okay, first of all, thank you for your great presentation. I would like just to say that as a fourth-year student, your work has been very helpful to me in my predicament and my progress through biochemistry in itself.
Thank you. Let me say that I think the distinction between a student and an author is that you have to get it right the first time round. I can have 10 editions trying to get it right.
My question is a little bit of more of a food for thought. What would you think that 100 years from now, looking back, could we see our current understanding of chemistry as a little bit of primordial, or would you think that our understanding nowadays is actually very advanced right now? What would you think?
Well, I think we understand just about every principle of chemistry. So I don't really see it changing. I think where we're moving into is into the realm of complex behavior. So although we understand fully simple materials, single molecules, even more, single atoms, it's the conjunction of different types of material giving rise to observable phenomena that might well reveal interesting new principles. They won't affect the more fundamental ones, but the application. And so, after all, in a sense, since we are just complex interacting bunches of molecules, we are gradually moving towards understanding our complex behavior in terms of. And I suppose a simpler question, you've given me time to think now, the sort of question that your question points to is whether there's any more laws of thermodynamics to discover. We've got 4. Is there a 5th, 6th, 7th, and so on? I suspect there might be a 5th, but it would be related to non-equilibrium thermodynamics rather than the equilibrium thermodynamics that is. So I think, although we probably know all the laws of equilibrium thermodynamics, as we move into non-equilibrium processes, there might be laws to discover.
Okay. Other questions? Professor?
Peter, thank you very much indeed for this excellent talk. But I may confess that I didn't understand nothing about the time and about the energy, and we need to recheck that in your books. But you said that from the nothing comes the energy and the time, right? Mm. Can we consider that nothing something like God?
No. I'm not going to be seduced into admissions of that kind. I mean, I think nothing is an amazing concept. And I think going almost back to your question, but enlarging it, I think the biggest question of all for physicists, chemists haven't got a hope in answering this question, but the biggest question of all for physicists to answer is how absolutely nothing switched into being something. Of course, philosophers have said it's either an impossible question, but it isn't, because there is obviously something around, and said that we will never understand it. But philosophers are pessimists, so it's the scientists who will get the answer, and then the pessimists, then the philosophers will say, yes, of course. But I think there are so many pointers towards the world emerging from being absolutely nothing, and still, in a sense, being absolutely nothing, but a very much more interesting form of absolutely nothing than absolutely nothing itself. So if you were to say, where does all the energy come from? And I say, as a scientist, I say as a poet, first of all, there's such a lot of it. Then I say as a scientist, how much is there? Because then I'll know the magnitude of the question that I need to tackle. And so I assess the energy of the universe. And I do that by weighing a galaxy, taking its mass and multiply it by c squared. And so I can get all the energy that is represented by the mass of every galaxy in the universe. And obviously I get a colossal energy. Back to the poet again. Where did almost infinite amount of energy come from? I'm bewildered. I cannot do this. I'm a philosopher. I will never be able to do it. But then I say, go back to being a scientist. And don't forget that this galaxy is attracted by that galaxy. And whenever you have an attraction between entities, it lowers their energy. So I take this galaxy, that galaxy, and my original colossal energy goes down a bit. I take this galaxy and this one goes down a bit more. You can see where this is heading. I take the interaction of every galaxy with every galaxy, and the sign, and include dark matter now, because that's all out there. And the signs are that is reducing that poet awesome energy down to the scientist's zero energy. So where did all the energy come from? There isn't any. It didn't come from anywhere. Nothing simply just became a much more interesting form of nothing. So you see, that's the point of doing science, is you simplify the questions you ask. To a point of stupidity, maybe, but if you can do it rationally, you might be able to proceed rationally to see what the real question is, not to answer the question of the poet, where did all this vastness come from, but to answer the question of the scientist, where did no energy come from? And I think the second is likely to be answered, and the former not.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, more questions? Professor Adelino?
Professor, I would like to ask you questions if, by symmetry with 10 Commandments, would you consider a 10 principle on radiation as a sort of logistics department that can bring energy from one place to the other? It does it in form of infrared or visible light.
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
If you would consider a 10 principle, you have 9
Yes.
principles,
Right.
10 on radiation.
Yes.
Either as heat or visible light, infrared radiation.
Yeah.
Because as a logistics department that transfers energy from one molecule to the other or from the sun to...
Yeah.
Because there are lots of photochemists here in this department, and there is no mention to radiation.
Well, I suspect even my 9 principles are over-elaborate. And it may be that there's only one principle, really, which embraces everything. I'd like that to be the case. Or even better, no principles at all.
Okay, any more questions? Up there?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. And I feel that more than ever, science communication is really important. Pseudoscience was recognized for a long time. I recommend, for example, the reading of Carl Sagan's book about this. But on top of the pseudoscience nowadays, we have the dangers of, I call it the Google researchers, who wrote some find some words and then read some, I would say, some rubbish material, and then take some emotional decisions about their own lives, the lives of their children, and sometimes put in risks the public health. I'm talking about, for example, people against vaccines, that adopt some crazy diets, and so on.
Tell me what she's asking.
Sorry?
Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So imagine them tomorrow I have an appointment with the Minister of Science or the Minister of Education. What sort of recommendations I could suggest them in order to somehow fight this problem of lack of knowledge, and everybody feels that they are experts and can take these emotional decisions about their lives and about the others. Shall
Vaccines, people are misinformed. If she were to be meeting with the minister,
Yeah. You have to rely on evidence.
Sorry?
You have to rely on evidence.
Yeah,
you
sure.
have to say, believe nothing until it can be supported by evidence. not sure if I've got really the thrust of your question. Is that...
Because I do
you're
feel
saying-
that as
you're
academic, we have some responsibilities academics. And I feel that we should take some measures in order to somehow educate people. I have these sort of conversations almost every day with people that, for example, they follow some crazy diets, like, for example, alkaline diet, and they believe they can fight cancer just because they are drinking alkaline water. You feel, you know, there is a hot topic nowadays in our society. It's the problem of vaccines. Like people that do not protect the children and, of course, the people around because they not believe in vaccines.
Yes.
And I think you have a responsibility in this way, somehow educate people about.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, well,
it's my English.
I'm afraid it's a long-term business of educating people.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process of making sure that stupid remarks aren't allowed to spread in the press, and even worse, perhaps, in the uncontrolled internet world. I mean, that's the danger of the internet running wild and spreading, you know, false facts, which are lies in the old-fashioned language. So you have to do everything you can to ensure that what you say is based on evidence.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, once again for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just a minute. So, to close the ceremony, and since Professor Maria João Romão couldn't attend its beginning, I would like to call her to say just a few words.
Because I was at a, well, okay. So I was saying nice to meet you. I could not be here before because I was at the Scientific Council.
Yes, I knew that. Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm here representing as the head of the department. And I must say I was very pleased with this announcement that our students could catch you and bring you here. That's really an honor for us. And I'm really proud for them and for all their initiatives. And I'm very thankful that you could come. That is a great honor and a pleasure. And it's very good for our students that we have such a prestigious professor with us. And I know they distributed also a list of your books that it is also with special conditions, etc. So I don't know if you have them available here or... Yeah.
Yeah,
and I was also very impressed with the simplicity as you showed. I myself am a chemist and I'm doing structural biology, and I'm always fascinated by impossible. No, I'm fascinated by chemistry, and I think chemistry is the basic of everything.
Yeah.
And I've had that discussion of the chemistry and physics, and if a chemistry is in a room and a physicist is in a room, they both think that chemistry is the basic of everything, or the physicist thinks the physics is the basic of everything. So you can't argue that, right. I feel. But in my own feeling, I think chemistry really helps a lot the biologists to understand the principles of life, and that is for sure. And what you brought here is really could be applied to biological systems. Although the complexity is enormous, and I'm fascinated by that all the time, how the human body works. It's just molecules, but the way they function and how it doesn't break more often, it's really puzzling.
Right.
So you didn't talk much about biology, but maybe you want to comment something?
I must learn some first.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so I think this is the time to close your session. And I don't know what is to follow, or it is just the closure of the session, and then there is some small gifts. So
Okay.
You still have some small gifts. So I congratulate you, I congratulate the students, and for your beautiful talk, and I thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.